Hi, welcome along. My name's Steve Dixon. I obviously work for Toitū, EnviroCare, and we're here to talk about the new tool that Toitū have developed called Carbon Assess, which is all about supporting the better understanding of supply chain emissions in our supply chains, but it's also got a dual use, which is to help support our SME and medium-sized businesses to get on board and to start to get their first footprint, and then get connected to ways to reduce that. The intent today is for me to give a little bit of background and introduction to why supply chain, why does it matter? And then we'll have a quick panel discussion. So we've got two people on our panel today, or three people on our panel today. We've got Ronya from in Toitū, who's one of our senior technical advisors. We've got Matt Parsons from New Zealand Post, who's been part of the development of this tool in our advisory group. And we have Simon Anderson, who's the product lead for Toitū. All right, so we're going to do this by way of numbers. All right, so that makes it quick, but hopefully gives you a pretty high level understanding of sort of what drove Toitū to engage in this supply chain question, and particularly with a focus on SMEs. We all know about that number, right? That's the number and the target that we need to meet to stop excessive global warming. So how do we do that? Well, we need to do it by 2050. That's our target for New Zealand. We're aiming for carbon neutral, as you're aware, which means a 50% reduction in megatons of real carbon. There'll be some offset support for that, but really what we need to do is get real reductions, get actual reductions. Primarily from businesses, but also households. We saw the public sector come on board yesterday. They've been on board for a while, many of you, but we've got new targets in that space, which is exciting. But there is a large cluster of businesses that are not really very engaged in this space. And part of this tool is about getting engagement to get to this number, to get a reduction of 50%. So we've got a number of companies already very engaged. Some of you are online. So these are CLC stands for Climate Leaders Coalition. There's about 120 of these businesses, and they've set themselves really significant targets around reductions and target setting, but also they're committing to work with their supply chain. So that's another major market, I guess, that we're looking to support, who have made obligations in this space and want to reach out. Now, they already represent 60% of our supply chain, of our emissions in New Zealand. There's some big companies in there. Air New Zealand and Fonterra are a couple of significance. So it's through this group and many others that we're wanting to reach some of those smaller SMEs who are not so active at the moment. And so we've got two sorts of emissions, right? We've got direct emissions, indirect emissions, and we've got these supply chain emissions. And so the direct emissions that are being produced by most of our businesses are estimated across the board and across the world in general to be less than 30% of all emissions, which is a good number and a good one to be working on. But that large group of companies in the Climate Leaders Coalition and the many others who are active, that means that their direct emissions, which they have direct control over, is actually a smallish proportion of the total emissions that are coming from business, which means that they need to reach out and talk to the other 70%, which is their supply chain. So here's the number of businesses that are SMEs in New Zealand. These are businesses that are less than 50 employees. Now, if you take less than 20 employees, which is a New Zealand standard measure, this is a sort of an international measure. But because we in New Zealand, we tend to use under 20 staff, and that's around about 95%. So what's that telling us? The vast majority of New Zealand businesses are SMEs. And what do we know about SMEs? They're focused on the next sale. They're focused on delivery of the last sale. They're focused on, where is Dave, their driver? He didn't turn up this morning, and all of the other issues and barriers that are well researched and understood in the SME space, which is that it's really hard for them to focus on their businesses because they're so deeply embedded in them. They're delivering day in, day out, trying to keep afloat, particularly this year. And so it's really hard to get their attention, and it's really hard, I guess, to lower the barriers that are in front of them, or the barriers that they see to getting engaged in this. And those barriers are around knowledge, those barriers are around cost, and those barriers are particularly around time and available time. So you'll see when we present the tool we've developed that we're looking to reduce all of those barriers as much as we can. So those 99% of New Zealand businesses are contributing about 35% of New Zealand's emissions. Now, if we go back a few slides and you think about the target that we need to reach, we need to reduce our emissions overall as a nation by 50% by 2050. Do the maths. We can't achieve that without these SMEs coming on board. And so we have to reach them. We have to find a way to engage with them, not in a compliance and regulatory way, because they don't respond well to that. We have to find a way to encourage and support them to get on this journey. And one of the ways to do that is to have conversations with them as a buyer and to reach down to them and say, look, we're doing this stuff. We think it's important to business. We think it's good for business. We would like you to come on board, and therefore you're providing them an opportunity to do that. So clearly, those numbers suggest that supply chain is important, that great mass of SMEs that are sitting out there have an important role to play, an important contribution to our emissions profile. And if we're going to achieve the targets that we all want to achieve, we'd better find a way to reach them. So at this stage, I want to move on to our panel. So I'd ask you all to unmute yourselves, please. All right, quick introduction to Ronja and Simon from Toitū. So Ronja is Swedish. She's one of our senior technical advisors. Those of you in Wellington will know her well. She's worked with a lot of our Wellington clients, but also elsewhere. She comes with a strong background, as you'd expect, at Toitū in environmental management and carbon reduction, and very much deeply embedded in the technical side of our business. Simon is the product lead for the Carbon Assess tool, and Simon comes with a background in product development and software as a service development, and so generally more of a stronger IT background, but with a strong ethos in the stuff we do. So I want to start with a couple of questions then. Ronja, this question about direct versus indirect emissions and supply chain emissions. So why are the direct emissions so low in New Zealand, under 30%?
Well, if we look at small enterprise, which, as we saw, makes up a large part of New Zealand business, many of those will have no vehicles, or they'll have one or two vehicles. They'll be very good at remote working. They'll be really good at keeping meetings online. So therefore, what we call their scope 1 emissions are often very low. That's your fuel use, essentially. We also see that in New Zealand, we're lucky to have a very low emissions national grid electricity footprint, which means that small enterprise often have an office or share an office, and so their electricity emissions are very low. That means that majority of their emissions actually sit outside of that, in their air travel and their freight, in their waste, and etc. So that's the reason why we see such small scope 1 and 2 emissions often for small enterprise.
Okay. That's also a similar number internationally though, isn't it?
Yes, very often when you have office-based sort of service organizations, which we have a lot of in New Zealand, they're often very low.
Right. So Simon, the reason behind the development of the tool, what are the sort of the pains that we're trying to take away from buyers and suppliers through the development of this tool?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Definitely there's two different users with two different kind of aims coming out of that relative to, the buyer, the large organization that's, wanting to work with their supply chain to find out these emissions, and, the motivations that are kind of bringing in the smaller supplier often around these tools. And, the big end of town are wanting, to work with supply chain. They, recognize that there is risk in here around having carbon, so much carbon in their supply chain, and they're looking to mitigate that and to work with their suppliers. They're not trying to get rid of their suppliers. They're not trying to use this as a yardstick to cut or to cut them. They're just wanting to mitigate that. And the challenges they face are really, if the process is too complex, if the process is too hard, then they're not going to get suppliers on board. And, like a lot of organizations, they're kind of short of time. So, that process of managing this and ensuring good data is coming through is often difficult. At the small end of town, these are busy people trying to keep their business afloat. They don't have a new compliance kind of activity that's kind of coming on board, is only going to cause more strife. So it needs to be quick, it needs to be efficient, and it needs to be affordable. And as well, they're looking to find out a little bit more about carbon, because it's something that they're hearing a lot about, but they don't know a lot about.
Cool. So I mentioned earlier that there are three sort of known barriers for SMEs to engage in sort of carbon reduction. One was time, and one was cost, and one was knowledge, or feeling that they don't understand or don't know enough. Can you just tell me a little bit about how the tool might sort of reduce those barriers?
Yeah, so as we'll see as we get through the demonstration, we've kind of tried to align the data that's coming through on the assessments with readily at hand operational data. So we're talking about electricity, fuel, freight, waste, and travel. So so the main removal to the barrier is just making it as simple and quick as possible, and like a fantastic digital experience. That much like we go through when we use our banking apps, when we use travel apps.
Okay. So Ronya, inside the tool there's a couple of sort of what you might call cheats for users, right? One is around waste, so that when we allow users not to incorporate waste in their footprint if they don't have a waste contract, and the other is freight, where if they're not spending $6,000, they don't need to calculate their freight contract. Can you just give us some sort of background as to why we've been able to build in those workarounds for businesses?
Yes, absolutely. I guess one main part is that we have more than 400 organizations in our programs if we include the UK. So we've obviously got quite a lot of data to look at when it comes to emissions for different businesses, different types of businesses within different industries. And what we have found with that data is that actually if an organization doesn't have a specific waste contracts, very often that waste is what we would call de minimis. So it's not material when it comes to in comparison to the total footprint. And the same goes for freight, where we had found that here in New Zealand, for organizations that spend very little on freight, and keep in mind as well that we only really look at freight from a above 2 kilo perspective. Other than that, because the packaging is often smaller or lighter, that means that couriers and other freight providers can actually fit quite a lot of freight in there. So the proportion for that business is very small, and therefore not material for that organization. So that's how we've been able to make the tool a bit easier for organizations and much more time efficient. But of course, an organization can always, if they suspect that they might have a significant amount of waste, then of course they can always look at that on the side.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Ronya. Hey, welcome, Matt. I'm glad you managed to find your way through the technology.
Thank you. Thank you for the welcome. Yes, it was quite a journey, but I'm here now, so that's great.
Good man, good man. Quick introduction first. So Matt's from New Zealand Post. He's been working with us on the development of this tool. We had an advisory group that included a number of large organisations and, as you'd expect, a bunch of SMEs, just to make sure we got the target audience right, that we built something that was fit for purpose. But Matt's a Whanganui man. He comes to us obviously from New Zealand Post. He looks after procurement there. He's worked for Westminster City Hall and has been doing a lot of work in Post around social procurement and kind of other areas around sustainable procurement. So the question I have for you, Matt, is around kind of what's changing in your space at the moment. So we hear the word social procurement. We know that sustainable procurement is kind of happening. But what's New Zealand Post been doing here, and what do you see as the trends that are happening out there for procurement specialists like yourself?
That's a good question. Firstly, Kara, everyone, thank you for this opportunity to speak. So that's a good question. There's a few parts of that one. I think, look, if we look at our suppliers, there's definitely more being expected from our suppliers. And I think that's because business is shifting. It's going through an evolution in sustainability. Everyone's trying to do a little bit better for the planet. And at New Zealand Post, we take sustainability very seriously. And as our commitment increases, so do the expectations that we have of our supply chain to help us meet our own goals. So to this point, I think that the new carbon assessment tool that's been developed is going to be very valuable for businesses, SMEs, to track their carbon output, compare like businesses, and improve on their own carbon footprint. But look, from a procurement sense, it's not just about price anymore. I think we've moved from that. Look, price is always going to be important for any sort of commercial or private entity, but there's a real paradigm shift around that value for money and expectations around that. So it's no longer about sort of DIFOTIS or how good the products or services are. It's also about the value, the broader outcomes, and the positive impact that can be generated from engaging with suppliers. And in light of that, one of the things we've been working on since 2017 is called social procurement. Now, you probably all heard about this, especially over the last couple of years with the broader outcomes. We started our journey in social procurement around 2017, where we've been actively seeking to engage in contracts with social enterprise businesses. And social enterprise businesses, if you don't know, so they work to, they operate for purpose, if you like. So they look to improve the lives of individuals, help communities, or invest in helping the environment. So another thing that we're doing, as well as social procurement, which is a massive part of my procurement team at the moment, and New Zealand Post, is looking at sustainability and changing the way in which we approach that within tendering as well. Historically, we've always put a weighting on sustainability, but we've thought recently about, well, you know, it's too important now, so we should stop weighting it and look at it as an overarching decision-making factor. So it's no longer a discussion with the business around, is it 2%, is it 10%, is it 20%? It's like, well, it's no percent, it's too important. So there are a couple of things that we're doing in that area. Another, yeah, it is. It's really positive step, I think. Just giving it that importance that I think it needs to have. So look, part of the question was what are areas of focus for New Zealand Post? We're in a bit of a unique position here because our supply chain is twofold. We have suppliers that we engage for the goods and services that we need to operate as a business, but also we have our own supply chain in terms of our delivery network, our air freight, and everything we need to provide our products and services to New Zealanders and abroad. So in our supply chain, if I'm going to focus on that, so we have 95% of all of our emissions generated through delivery to our customers, and that's our road delivery network and air freight. And to that, our contractor model is a big part of this, and they're the courier vans that you see on the roads. That's the likes of Courier Post, Pace, Rural Post, and provincial delivery. So we don't own these vans, but so we can't change the CO2, the emissions output, but we can definitely help the drivers to understand more about their emissions and educate them and talk them through how to reduce their emissions. So in that, we have an incentivized program called EVAN or EVAN, part of our sustainability team, this program. And that's where New Zealand Post has said we'll contribute to the purchase price of electric vehicles for our contractor fleet, with a minimum of 50% of the price difference between an EV and its petrol or diesel equivalent. So that would be funded from our existing decarbonisation funds, and that's one of the things that we're doing to try and enhance or reduce the CO2 emissions and enhance our sustainable footprint. And we also have an owned fleet, and you know, that's quite significant as well. You might have seen the 420 odd Paxters we've got around. They're the little golf cart type machines that we've got delivering mail and parcels. We also have our own vans. We have motorcycles. We have forklifts. So we're looking at shifting our owned fleet into complete EV if we can by 2023. So that's our goal there. And look, we've got a lot of work going on in this area. There's a lot of strings attached to our overall sustainability objectives. But as the saying goes, it won't happen overnight, but it will happen, and we're getting there.
Brilliant. Hey, good stuff, Matt. Thank you. Look, we'll move on to showing the tool, and that should take us about 20 minutes, and we should have about 10 minutes for questions. So the panel will stick around, and they'll be our expert panel to respond to your questions. Please put them in the chat, and you know how that works. Just put the chat in, and I'll read them out, and our panel will respond. But now I'll hand over to Simon, and he'll undertake a demonstration of the tool we've developed.
Oh, brilliant. All right. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to quickly run through the tool, primarily from the supplier side of it. I'm going to show how to go through and create an assessment. Then for that data that comes out of the assessment, how to share that with, say, a buyer who's requested it. And as well, then to close it out to show, what that collated data looks like for the buyer. So how we kind of see the process normally playing out is that a supplier has been invited by their buyer to come through and to do an assessment. And once they go through and they run through, what is a pretty straightforward kind of, like signing up for kind of Netflix or anything like that process. Now, they arrive on this screen here, which is we call the dashboard. And within the dashboard, you can see those areas of that the assessment covers of fuel, electricity, travel, freight, and waste. Now, when they're ready, they just click on Start the Assessment, and it starts with a couple of recommendations for the supplying organisation doing their assessment. That we suggest that they use the same reporting period as their financial reporting, just to align this data, and we suggest that they start with the most recently completed financial year. And the reason for that being that means that they have all the data at hand to finish that first assessment. So to start through, they go and enter the reporting period that they want to start with. So 4th to the 3rd, pretty standard one there. Then they click on getting started. Now, the first bit of information that's requested is gross revenue. And the reason for that is we use gross revenue to factor the carbon that they do. So, what we end up with is an intensity that is kilos of carbon per $1,000 of revenue. And the reason for factoring it by revenue allows the supplier doing this to compare it to previous years and also to compare it to other organizations in their sector. So, total carbon amount probably doesn't mean much to them, but total carbon per $1,000 of revenue, which they can compare to the previous year and that they can compare to other organizations in their sector, starts being more of a useful metric. So let's enter that in here. Then they're taken through into electricity, and that's done in kilowatt hours. This is, kind of information that is readily available at, within your electricity bills. This could be entered as a single entry once a year, or you could do it, as the statements, 12 entries, one for each month. But, just noting there, it's data that's kind of readily at hand. Clicking next takes them through into fuel, and with fuel there's a lot of different types, and we'll say select petrol here. We can see for petrol the measurement can be entered in litres. Say they're using that from a fuel card, or dollars if they want to go through and do it receipts, or taking a total number out of zero. We can see again an entry is added in here, and up here we can see the total carbon produced by that petrol. These figures are coming through from MFE factors. So that's where we're drawing the factor that's used for that calculation from. Certain kind of types of fuel, we can't use dollar amounts because there's just so much variance in price, and coal is an example of that. But we feel pretty confident you'd be able to get that information through from an invoice or potentially from a receipt. From there into travel, and we have a calculator here that'll take you out to the calculator, and from there, for air travel, you can work out the kgs of CO2 equivalents by entering flight data in there. Just to speed things up, I won't show that process, but the travel calculator gets that information for you. And the other material thing relative to travel that we wanted to include was accommodation. So that can be added in there as well. Through into waste and freight. So depending on whether you have a waste disposal contract, it means whether that's material or not. And if you do, then it's coming in meters cubed or kilograms. And if you do have one of these contracts, we'd expect that this information would be readily at hand for you. Now, the final thing to enter is, and sorry that I'm going at quite a clip through this, but is for freight. And the kind of qualifying question for this one is if you spend over $6,000 annually. And if you do, it starts becoming material. And from there, we're interested in tons kilometers. Now, ultimately, we want to bring this down to factors, such as dollar spend, but it's tons kilometers at the moment. But I'm sure your friendly logistics people at an organisation like New Zealand Post will be able to help you with that figure. And if not, we have some factors to help with that calculation. So I'll add that entry in, and from there, click done, and it takes you back to the carbon, back to the dashboard, where we can see all this information is in here. Now, if I click publish, it kind of publishes that report out, and we can see from there it's switched over from total tons to this kgs of CO2 equivalents per $1,000 of revenue. So for this organization here, for every $1,000 of revenue they generate CO2 equivalents of 65.17 kilos of carbon for every $1,000 of revenue. Now, from there, they can click download, and what that will do is produce a PDF report for of the dashboard, and I'll just bring that up, and within there we can see the kind of for this company here, we've got these kind of averages, how they're doing relative to other organizations in their sector, and once they go through and they this is their first assessment. Once they've done that kind of second year, it will show a comparison to how they did in previous years. Now, just to close things out, I want to show how that they can share that data with a supplier, with a buyer. And they go through and do that by clicking on share, adding in and I'll just copy that over. I'll just copy this, bear with me. The account number of their stakeholder. So say this company was it's construction company, as a subcontractor was sharing it with kind of a parent construction company, they would click into their account number here and click shared data. And if I scroll down here, we can see now that it's showing that they've shared that data with this organization called Simon Services. Now, I'll just quickly log out and log into Simon Services and show what that looks like on the buyer's side, just to close out the demonstration. And I'll just log on to here. Now, on the buyer side, so this is the organization that suppliers are sharing data with. They can look down here and they can see all the names of all the organizations that have shared data with them. And if we look down here, we can see this company that we just did the assessment for, their data's been shared. And if they click approve, then this data is added through, excuse me, to their data set. And from here, they can then go through and download that data in CSV format. And we'll just wait for that to come down, and I'll show you what that looks like. And how that looks is they get in a CSV format all the organizations down here that have shared data with them. Some contact name, email, and the name of the organization, industry and sector, the year the assessment was for, start date, end date, the overall organization stuff as total carbon per $1,000 of revenue, the change once they've done a second year on last year, and how they're sitting relative to their sector. And then there's that breakdown into electricity, fuel, travel, freight, and waste in there. So if I'm, working within procurement, within these organizations, or within sustainability, I can see how my different organizations in my supply chain are doing kind of relative to each other. And from there, like maybe work on some programs as, say New Zealand Post is with their electric vehicles, and to see, what are the reductions that are coming through based on that. Or, if I notice that, within certain sectors in my supply chain, like say travel is pretty high, maybe I can work on another program to help lower that. So that's the rapid pass through there. Look, apologies everyone for the pace, just trying to make sure that we have plenty of time at the end for questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll hand it back to you, Steve.
Kia ora, Simon. Thank you. Yes, that was, that's the fastest I've ever seen you do it. Look, for those of you out there who couldn't quite keep up, we're really happy to do an individual presentation to your business and kind of walk you through a little bit more slowly. And we also have a video that we can supply that you can control the speed of, so you can see pretty much what Simon just showed you, but step by step with a voiceover. So thank you for that. Look, we've got a couple of questions coming already. I'll start with Irene. So I'll start this first question for you, Ronya, actually. So obviously Toitū does a bunch of things, including most of our clients are on our certified programs, which is using ISO 14064. And there's a question from Irene that relates to that, I think, which is she's asking, can Toitū clients use the tool for their value chain emissions? Can you first explain what do you think she means? And then does it tool work to respond to that?
Yes, absolutely. So for organizations in our programs, they use a tool called eManage, where they input their activity data and then that spit out a equivalent tons of CO2. So if an organization is in our program, they can have their suppliers put in data into the carbon assess tool and use the report that comes out of that tool to guide whether it's material or not for their carbon reduce or carbon zero footprint. So that's absolutely, but just keep in mind that there are two different tools and it's sort of reliant on your suppliers in feeding in information back to you. So that's absolutely possible.
Great, thank you. Simon, a question from Matthew. Is there a function that allows you to offset your total carbon?
Look, that's a great question, Matthew. Not directly within the tool at the moment. You can go through and offset them through, Toitū does publicly sell carbon credits. So, if you wish at the end, you can. I think, one of the key things that we're ultimately aiming for around this is reduction. So, knowing what carbon, capturing, details of what carbon you've got is definitely the starting point. And then from there move into offset, but ideally aiming on reduction. But not built into the tool. It's on the roadmap to be put inside the tool, but the help does have a link where you can buy credits off of Toitū to offset if you wish.
Cool, thank you. Hey, look, that word help that you just mentioned draws me to another question around, so what support are we providing to SMEs in the tool to help them reduce? So it's very well, they get a measurement, they get a quick measurement in a sort of under an hour, 2 hours, but then what?
Yeah, so we've kind of we've focused on in the tool around the measurements, but we're out. ECA is a partner of ours, and they were a very generous partner in the development of this tool. So through their Gen Less program, they have a lot of advice for business around making reductions. We've also done work with the Sustainable Business Network, SBN, who are, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, coming out in the early next year, they will have a program for small business as to, I suppose a framework to work through around making those reductions.
Terrific. Cool. Yes, I would want to reiterate the thank you to ECA. So they did provide a substantial sum of money to help us build this and to build it quickly using some really smart external support from a development company called Alfero, who I'll give a plug to because they were brilliant. And I think the front end of the tool shows some of their talents. Just because you went through it quite quickly, I want to just come back to one of the functions within the tool, which is around discounting. So what does discounting enable and why is it in there?
Yeah, look, sorry, look, sorry again. I went through it at quite the pace, and then I didn't show the video of someone signing up. Now, when we went out and we worked with our panel around developing the tool, the idea that the supplier would pay for the price of the subscription to use the tool, for some buyers in some sectors, they were completely happy with that and saw that this is a cost of business, and this is something that would be borne by suppliers. But for others, such as manufacturing, they felt very uncomfortable feeling that their suppliers would pay for the subscription. They felt that was something that they wanted to meet. So the solution we came up with was allowing buyers to offer their suppliers a discount code, anything from 10% through to 100. So, if a buying organization says, hey, we don't want our suppliers to pay, then, what they'll do as part of that onboarding process is supply them with a discount code, which they can enter when they do the registration, which will mean that, like for, like a month or forever, that the tool will be, fully discounted or partially discounted.
Cool, thank you. Ronya, benchmarking. Can you just tell us a little bit about how the benchmarking works inside the tool?
Yes, absolutely. So if a supplier is putting in their information, they can then see how they compare to average in terms of their emissions. But also if you're a large buyer and you have multiple suppliers feed in their information, you can actually compare your suppliers to each other. And of course, engaging in conversation there, you could potentially have all of your suppliers share the information among each other. And we have entered in some generic benchmarks for New Zealand averages, so that organizations can compare how they meet up to the competition. Okay.
Oh, thank you. So Matt, listening to this, and I think this might be the first time you've had a proper walk through the tool. You'll be getting, if you were a buyer and you'd sent this out to say, your top 100 suppliers, and what you got back were ratios, which told you the kilograms of carbon per $1,000 of revenue that those suppliers were emitting. How would you think you would, as an enterprise, would use that data?
That's a good question. I think any information that we can extract from our suppliers at the moment is really valuable. It's a start point. So it opens up a conversation and a discussion. If we can compare it on categories of spend across markets, then that would be even richer information for us to have that conversation and say, hey, look, you're behind the trend. And let's talk about ways that you can improve on this particular area or reduce your carbon footprint. And this is what we're doing at New Zealand Post. And look, if you can learn from us there and put in place these projects or initiatives, then it might help you. So I think any information is powerful in this particular area at the moment.
Great, thank you. Now, Simon, I imagine there are people thinking about what's this going to cost me? So can you give us a rundown first on what this costs for enterprises, so the buyer end, and then what it costs for SMEs?
The pricing for SMEs is $30 a month. So that's a month-on-month subscription. That's kind of comes out of is charged to a credit card. And for the buyers, as we touched on, they can look to offset those costs of their suppliers. But the basic license cost that kind of comes through is it's split into 4 packages: small, medium, large, and unlimited. And it's priced on how many suppliers that they can connect with. So 1 to 25 is an annual license cost of $900. Connecting to 26 to 100, that's $1,800. And large, which is connecting to 100 to 1,000, is $9,000 a year. And unlimited, which is 1,000 plus connections, so over 1,000, is $12,000 annually.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So if an enterprise was on the tool and they were wanting to discount, does the enterprise pay the proportion of the SME fee that they're discounting?
Yeah, that's correct. So if a buyer wants to create a discount code for its suppliers, then they meet the proportion that they are discounting.
Great. Okay. Hey, look, a really good question from Tina. So does the tool help buyers understand what proportion of the emissions that they're so let me get this wording right. Does it show the proportion of the supplier's business that relates to the organization in question? If you wanted to add your supplier's emissions to your organization's emissions, how would you do that? So I think the first question in there is, we know that, you may have a number of suppliers. Some of them might be huge. If you work with Downers as a supplier because they did some construction for you, you don't want all of Downers' footprint in your supply chain footprint. You want their proportion that they have emitted as in servicing you. How does the tool help with that?
Yeah, so what it does is, because we're using this factored by $1,000 of revenue figure, so kgs of CO2 equivalents per $1,000 of revenue, and when you see that for a supplier, and say it's 5 kilos per $1,000 of revenue, and you do 500, you do $1,000 worth of business with them, then you know that you've got 5 kilos from them. So you can use that figure to work out, based on revenue, or how much they have business they do with you, what your proportion of their overall carbon is.
Okay. Matt, for an organisation like yourself that's working in a number of areas around sort of supply chain, and you're interested in not only what their carbon footprint is, right, but you're interested in the other activities that these suppliers are up to. One of the things we're thinking about, and I'll be interested in your view on this, is that over time, if we have the interest and the demand, that we'd look to add modules that would, for instance, ask about modern day slavery and allow a buyer to understand what policies are in place and activities are in place. It might also add a module around sort of labour relations and pay rates, in the sense of, are you paying the minimum wage or the living wage? And then you might do environmental things, so around toxins or plastics use or packaging. Is that something that you as a large enterprise would be interested in seeing over time?
Yeah, it certainly is. Sustainability is broad, as we know. As part of our role in procurement, it's getting more and more important for us to reach out to our vendors and talk to them about what are they doing in these other areas. It's not all about carbon, like you've just alluded to. There's a lot of other aspects that are really important to us and how our supply chain operates onshore and certainly offshore as well. So the easier it would be for us to talk to our supply chain and get that information from them, the better it would be. At the moment, if you're looking internationally, then there's independent auditing, there's different things that you can look at to be able to deliver that information for New Zealand Post from its supply chain. But having I guess a one-stop shop onshore for our SMEs or our businesses that work within New Zealand or abroad would be really helpful.
Selva's interested. I'd also am keen to understand, how do we follow the supply chain to its source? I understand that we can engage with the suppliers who we work with directly, but what about their suppliers? This is a tough question, right? So I'm going to throw it to you, Ronya, first, because you're the smartest person in the room. And then Simon can think about his answer.
Well, there's a few different options. Of course, understanding how much outsourcing is going on within your supply chain is I guess a matter of discussing with your suppliers. But of course, there is the option of inviting the sort of the third tier down and using the tool as well to understand and then work backwards what the emissions associated with your business are. But there is certain aspects of probably conversation and first understanding how much outsourcing is there from your suppliers.
Yeah, and just to add to that around, the carbon assessors, I suppose, from that assessment and supplier side, it's the start of a journey around this. So, it's not the end. So, around getting some carbon data from, organizations who haven't even considered yet doing, like a carbon assessment. This is the starting point around that, and like maybe from there, these organizations will start looking a bit more deeper and a bit more complete. But yeah, this is very much designed around the organization starting.
Great. And look, scope is a conversation we have a lot with clients. All right, where do you draw that line? It's always a little complicated, but in this case, the tool is available to anybody. So if you're interested in a particular supplier's supply chain, you can ask them to undertake the tool, and they can do the same to their suppliers. So you can expand the circle endlessly. One of the questions we've had a lot, which hasn't come up today, but we have had in conversations with various businesses in the last week or two, because the tool's only been out for just over 3 weeks, is around our international suppliers, right? So we've had, those with Australian, Singaporean, Thailand, Chinese suppliers. What do they do? Well, look, at the moment, the emissions factors that are embedded in the back of the tool that give you your carbon numbers are New Zealand emissions factors. Now, a number of those are translatable internationally, so your fuel emissions factors are largely the same. Wherever you burn coal, it's the same emissions impact pretty much anywhere. Same with most fuels. Likewise, flights are very similar across the world. And so is freight, because it's fuel really that you're picking up. But electricity and waste can be different, because we have a reasonably high waste footprint, because we're still landfilling a lot. And so what we're thinking about doing in kind of version 2 and 3 of the tool is is incorporating international factors. We're not there yet, and we won't be ready to do it immediately, but it is on our mind and we're aware of it. But certainly there's plenty to do within the New Zealand supply chain initially. So let's get on with that and help our own people get going, and then we'll look further afield. Hyrene's back with a question on social sustainability, Matt. Is there room to add social sustainability questions, e.g. modern day slavery, labour standards into the tool, i.e. avoid making multiple engagements and queries to suppliers? I think that's been asked and answered, but let's just confirm. Simon.
Yeah, definitely around roadmap wise, looking more broadly at sustainability from the SME perspective is something that we're quite keen to do. So yeah, there's definitely room for that. But yeah, it just wasn't included at MVP point.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. And another question from Sylvia, is digital data and the internet considered a material source of emissions? Ronya, that one's coming to you.
Yes. This is a question we're getting very frequently at the moment after lockdown and more organizations moving over to more remote ways of working. I guess 3 aspects to consider. Number 1, how big is it in comparison to your total footprint? When we talk about materiality, we always need to make sure that we put it in relation to the total footprint. The second bit is how much digital data do you have, and how intensive is your business, and where is your service provider's server sitting? So unfortunately, I can't say yes or no. It really depends on the business. What we have done some preliminary analysis, and for a small enterprise in New Zealand, most of the time it won't make up a material enough part of their footprint. But there will definitely be businesses out there where it is a material part of their footprint.
Brilliant, thank you. Now look, we've hit time, so I'm going to call an end to this for today. Look, thank you, Matt, in particular for your time today. And thank you to all of those who are online and listening. Really appreciate your interest, and hopefully we'll talk more soon. Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Ronja.